we...
Okay, you're good to go.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those in attendance, excuse me, at this remote meeting of the local review body of Aberdeen City Council. My name is Councillor Henrickson, and I'll be chairing the meeting today with Councillors Clark and Councillors Van Sweden are also in attendance and will be participating. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for the public access after the meeting. You are also reminded to note that we may have members of the public or press observing today's proceedings. Can I ask those who are observing today's meeting to keep their microphones and cameras switched off throughout? Can members of the review body leave their cameras on but mute their microphones when not speaking? As the local review body is a quasi-judicial business, members are reminded that they should not leave the meeting during consideration of the reviews. This meeting has been convened in response to 3 requests for a review of the decisions taken by the appointed officer under the council scheme of delegation. Members of the local review body have before them copies of the review documents as listed in the notice calling the meeting. I will now ask Lindsay McBain, the assistant clerk, to outline the procedure to be followed in conduct of these reviews.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Members have the procedure note, which was circulated with the meeting papers and is intended to set out the wider framework within which the review process operates. From this, it is clear that the first task for the review body is to come to a decision on whether the review documents contain sufficient information for the case to be determined without further procedure, and by that it is meant without further information or representations. To assist, I feel it would be helpful to mention the following. Firstly, that the regulations governing the local review process require that all matters which the applicant intends to raise in the review must be set out in or accompany the notice of review. Secondly, that the focus of the review should be on the basis of what was before the appointed officer when a decision was made, and only in exceptional circumstances will new or additional matters be permitted to be taken into account. Thirdly, to note that the modernisation of the planning system, which included revisal of the planning appeals process, of which this local review body is part, removed the previous right on the part of an applicant to insist on a hearing and replaced that with a local review body, providing them with the power to choose a procedure which more accurately reflects the facts and circumstances of the individual case. And lastly, that guidance issued by the Scottish Government's Chief Planner in 2011 stated that reviews by LRBs should be conducted by means of full consideration of the application afresh. This review should take the form of a structured discussion led by the chairperson to consider the matter set out in the notice of review before you, and I would conclude by drawing your attention in particular to points 10 to 12 of the procedure note. Thank you, Chair. You're on mute, Councillor.
I'll get it one of these days. Turning to the consideration of the first review, as Councillor Van Sweden just disappeared. Oh, no, sorry. No, the screen moved and you moved position. That's all. I just got confused there. Turning to consideration of the first review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the detailed planning permission for the erection of a single-storey rear extension, porch to front and first floor side extension over garage at 30 Crookshank Crescent, reference number 220891 DPP. We will now hear the planning advisor in attendance, Ms. Green, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would point out that Ms. Green attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because she has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Ms. Green will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect her role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Over to you, Ms. Green.
Thank you, convener. I'll just share my screen. Right, so yes, this review is into the refusal of the application under delegated powers, which was for the erection of a first floor. Sorry, I've got the wrong one up. Just confusing myself with having to reopen everything.
That's okay. I got confused because they're both very, very similar myself.
Yes.
Without reading papers.
Right, hold on a second. Right, Crookshank Crescent, Bucksburn. Okay, this is an application that was refused under delegated powers for the erection of a single-storey rear extension, which was actually permitted development, a porch to the front and first floor extension, which is actually over a driveway or carport rather than over a garage, as the description said. And the review has been submitted with all the necessary information within the time limit of 3 months following the decision of the appointed officer. The applicant has indicated on the notice of review that there is no new matters that have been raised in the submissions. And in terms of procedure by which the review should be conducted, the applicant expressed the view that the review may proceed on the basis of the information submitted. So I'll now provide some background information to the case before handing back to members to decide how to proceed. So this is the location plan, and Crookshank Crescent is in Bucksburn, in the area between Keppel Hills Road and the Bucksburn Howes Road area. And this is a modern 2-storey end terrace dwelling with front, side and rear curtilage and joined to number 32. So the other half of it's semi-detached. And the house fronts onto Crookshank Crescent, which is bounded on all sides by other residential properties and their gardens. And this is overhead photograph, just showing the house with the driveway to the side and the neighbour's driveway. 3D image just showing the relationship between the application house and the neighbouring property, which is 1.5 stories in height, and that's to the northeast. So that's slightly lower property there at number 28. And this is the 3D image from the rear. Just the application properties driveway there. Street view from Crookshank. And this is where the upper level extension would go, and then the porch extension. I've just added this one in, which shows the gable of the neighbouring house at number 28. So this is the site plan as proposed, and it shows the extensions added. That the rear extension is actually permitted development, so not part of the application. And then this is the side extension and the front porch. And then the front elevation. And the roofs over the porch and side extension would be finished in slate, with the walls in white chip on white cement to match the house. Fascia boards and gutters would also match. And the report of handling notes that the window to the side extension is not centrally aligned and is of a slightly different size to the existing windows. So just to note that, looking at that front elevation. This is the side showing the porch extension here, and that's the rear extension, which is permitted development. And similarly, the northeast elevation, and the porch would measure 2.5 meters in width and 1.88 in depth. So that's the rear elevation, showing the extension above the carport, and it would extend the full width of the house, which is 6.18 meters, and it would be 2.83 meters wide to the boundary. And the ridge of this extension would sit just over 200 millimeters below the ridge of the house. In terms of consultations, the roads team were consulted and had no objection, and Bucksburn Community Council had no comments. So turning to the reasons for refusal, the impact on the neighbour to the side at number 28 in terms of daylight to the window on the gable, and the second reason was that the extension to the side would not be complementary to the existing dwelling and out of character with the area, and that the proposal was therefore contrary to policies H1 and D1, residential areas and design, and also the householder design guide. And for the applicant, their case stated that the proposal is the same as extensions approved at Marshall Gardens, numbers 20 and 22, which are under construction. And secondly, that the gable window in the neighbour's house used to be a bedroom, but it's now a small store and is being converted to a shower room, and that the neighbour has confirmed they have no objection. There were no comments from the Community Council and no representations received. So at that point, I will hand back to you, convener, for a decision on how to proceed.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We now need to consider, whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members, remember that if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request that further written information be provided, hearings be arranged, or a site visit be undertaken. I feel for this case I have sufficient information. Councillor Clark, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision?
I have sufficient information.
Thank you. Councillor Van Sweden, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision?
I have sufficient information, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Van Sweden. As members feel that they have sufficient information, we will now hear from Ms. Green on the relevant policies and considerations for this review.
Thanks. I'll just share the screen again. Oops, sorry, I've missed the remainder of the applicant's case, so I'll just cover that now. Further points that were made by the applicant were that in terms of the householder design guide, front extension criteria and policy H1, the design fits well with the composition of the drive and other properties. The windows at first floor level contribute to the street scene. Sorry, that some of those don't relate to this case. I think that slide's got in. I'll move on to the policies. So policy H1, the site lies within a residential area. So it's designated under policy H1. And in those areas, development is acceptable in principle. Residential development is acceptable in principle, and it's subject to various criteria. And the first two criteria are relevant. Does the application constitute overdevelopment? And the guide in the householder development guide refers to 50% coverage of the curtilage. So the report didn't refuse the application on the basis of overdevelopment. So the second criteria is whether it would have an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area. So that's where you would take into account the impact on daylight, sunlight, and visual amenity. Third criteria, the proposal doesn't result in the loss of any open space, so that's not relevant in this case. And the fourth criteria, that would refer to the householder development guide. So in terms of the householder development guide, extensions should be architecturally compatible in design and scale with the house and surrounding area. Two-story extensions to the side may be acceptable, subject to the criteria that I've just mentioned. And front extensions, so in terms of the porch, should be of a scale and design complementary to the dwelling. And there's an emphasis on glazing to those. So overall, careful consideration to the impact on adjacent properties, visual amenity, building lines, and the position of adjacent buildings. And then there's also guidance on how to assess daylighting and sunlighting, the methods that have been used and highlighted in the report of handling. In terms of policy D1, it's important to consider the context of the proposal, and the policy recognises that not all development is of a scale that makes a significant difference to placemaking, but it's clear that good design and detailing is important in adding to the attractiveness of the built environment. In terms of the evaluation, just a reminder that it's all applications should be determined in accordance with development plan policies unless material considerations indicate otherwise, and that each application should be treated on its merits. So in this case, the basis for decision would be how the proposal affects the character and amenity of the area, and especially in terms of the occupiers of neighbouring properties. In terms of policy H1 on residential areas and also the householder development guide. So does the proposal comply with the development plan when considered as a whole, or are there material considerations which weigh for or against the proposal? And that's my presentation, so happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Are there any questions?
No.
No. I do have a couple of questions. I'm slightly concerned about the space between the parking space to the next door property and the width of that has for easy access into their cars. Is that something that we would have to consider?
Well, the extension would only extend up to the boundary, so the existing situation wouldn't be that they would rely on the neighbour's land to access their vehicle. They would still, it wouldn't encroach onto their driveway, so they would have sufficient space.
Ample space, right? Thank you. It was just the question. I was thinking that if they were opening their doors and there was a wall next to it, it might it rather than an open space. But if that's not something we can consider, then that's fair enough. The window on the side of the property next door, is that a west facing window? Trying to figure out myself whether it's a west facing window.
It's southwest.
Southwest. And we've had no objections from the people next
No.
door, and I take it they've actually spoken to the neighbours.
Well, they would have received notification.
Yes, and you would have spoken to them.
Well, yeah, can't comment on that.
Yeah, no. it mentioned in the papers that part of the issue was the roof line. Are we happy with the roof line? Because it's what, 20 centimeters lower than the roof line next door to the existing building. Is that a major consideration?
It seems to be in terms of the impact on light reaching the other property rather than the height in itself of the roof line.
Okay, and how critical is the positioning of the windows? Because there's some of the reasons in the report were that, if I read it correctly, that the windows are slightly out of alignment compared to the windows in the rest of the building.
Yeah, that's the window on the front elevation of the side extension. I mean, it's slightly larger, so it sits on a slightly different alignment. It's really down to what members feel the impact of that would be.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Green. Right, in accordance with the procedure notes circulated in the local review body, we will now discuss and decide the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. I'm minded to overturn the officer's decision here with regarding policy H1. It's not overdevelopment. It's a relatively minor extension, which with regards to policy D1 is not having a major impact on the area. I think if we'd had representation from the people next door regarding the building, I would be of more concern, but generally with I'm quite happy with it. Just give me a moment. Yes, with regard to policy D1, I actually feel that the building actually the extension fits in with the streetscape. I think it's yeah, I think it fits most of the things in with regards to policy D1. So I don't think it's overdevelopment. I think it's appropriate. So I'm minded to overturn the officer's recommendation and approve. Councillor Clark, could you please state your decision in respect to the application and state for the minute of the ground of that decision referring to planning policy where appropriate?
Likewise, myself, I don't think it's overdevelopment. I would like to overturn the decision. I have looked at all the angles and taken in all the fact of the street, the next door neighbour, etc. I do not feel it's overdevelopment. And I think it's not going to have a knock-on effect to number 28, and that would be the only person in that area that it would have effect on. 28, as they now said, downstairs is now a shower room as opposed to a previous bedroom. So I would like to overturn the decision, and on my grounds that it's not overdevelopment, and I actually think it's in keeping with the street.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Van Sweden.
Yeah, on this occasion, I would support the officer's decision. So I do think that it is affecting the amenity of the neighbour, and despite the plaintiff, they have stated that the neighbour is okay with this. I would probably like to hear from the neighbour with regards to that as well. So those are my concerns, but yes, I see that I'm in a minority.
Thank you, Councillor Van Sweden. Sometimes these are very fine lines. As the local review body has agreed to overturn the decision, of the appointed officer, we now need to consider whether any conditions should be attached to the appropriate application. Do we have any conditions which people wish to apply? No. Please.
Well, I'm just going to interrupt, convener. I am concerned about the neighbour and how they actually feel about it. So perhaps a representation from the neighbour.
I'm afraid that's not a planning. They haven't made representation so far, so we can't go back and ask for further representation. So we've actually made the decision of a majority of 2-1 to approve the application with no conditions. Please note that a decision notice for today's meeting will be issued to the applicant or agent after the meeting. Are we all content with that? Okay, now turning to the request for the second review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the detailed planning permission for the erection of a first floor extension over an existing garage to front 1 West Craig Park Crescent, Aberdeen, reference number 220358 DPP. We will now hear the planning advisor in attendance, Ms. Green, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I will point out that Ms. Green attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because she has not been involved in earlier consideration of the application under review. Ms. Green will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in fact, her role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Over to you, Ms. Green.
Thank you, convener. Let me get my presentation up. Right. This is a review into the refusal of an application under delegated powers for the erection of a first floor extension over the existing garage. And this is in West Craig Bank Crescent in the new development known as Friarsfield, and that's on the north side of Cults. And the review has been submitted with all the necessary information within the time limit of 3 months following the decision of the appointed officer. The applicant has indicated on the notice of review that new matters have been raised, and those are the information about the applicant's personal circumstances and also Cala's plans for other plots with within the same development. And it's for members to decide whether they wish to take those matters into consideration. I can go on to mention what those relate to. Do you want to comment on that now, convener?
Yes, I would be happy certainly to hear what the Cala's additional plans for the area are, to see whether that has an effect on my decision. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Other members? Yeah, nodding heads there. Okay, thank you.
And the other matter related to the applicant's elderly parents.
Fiona?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to jump in, but I just wondered if it would be helpful for me to set out the tests that have to be considered when new matters are put before the LRB, just if it was helpful at all.
That would be very, very helpful, Fiona.
Yeah. So just bear with me 2 seconds. So the test is set out within the legislation, which is as follows. In a review, a party to the proceedings is not to raise any matter which was not before the appointed person at the time the determination reviewed was made, unless that party can demonstrate that the matter could not have been raised before that time, or that it's not being raised before that time was as a consequence of exceptional circumstances. the second part of that test states that nothing in subsection 1, so the 2 points I've just raised there, affects any ability to have regard to the provisions of the development plan or any other material considerations. So I appreciate with this one here, I think Ms Green has said that there are 2 different pieces of new information, one with regard to CALA and the second one with regard to the applicant's personal circumstances. And I also understand that the latter ones make reference to providing additional space for elderly relatives, some of whom have a disability. So I did just want to flag, just hopefully to be helpful, that the public sector quality duty is a material consideration when it comes to planning decision making. But by me saying that doesn't mean that it's for you as the LRB to decide, what weight you do apply to that. But I just thought it'd be useful just to note that just now. But happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Fiona. So that means that we can actually take both of these into consideration and still be within the bounds of the LRB. I just wanted to get that clear because I get quite confused with legal things.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's ultimately the LRB's decision. The tests are, ideally the applicant should be in the review demonstrating, why this information was not, put at an earlier point to the appointed officer. So, but notwithstanding that, if you do want to take that into account, then you can. And I think the important point about the public sector quality duty, so for the issues with the elderly relatives and potential people with disability using that space as well, is that is a material consideration. So, notwithstanding the fact that, they should really demonstrate why this has been submitted, this is still a material consideration that should always be taken into account in planning decision making.
Thank you, Fiona. Sorry for that interruption, Lucy. I think we're all quite happy with taking this additional information after Fiona's information there. So if you'd like to start again, Ms. Green, I'll be happy. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll revert to where I was. Just a moment. I'll share the screen again. Yeah, so those 2 matters are covered in the applicant's statement of review, and one of them is it shows CALA's plans for other plots within the same development where this type of development was approved within the original planning permission. And the second matter was, as Fiona mentioned, the elderly parents coming to visit, and that 2 of those are disabled, and it would be helpful for them to have their own independent accommodation above the garage. So in terms of the procedure by which the review will be conducted, the applicant has expressed the view that the review may proceed on the basis of the information submitted. So I'll continue to provide some background to the case before handing back for a decision on how to proceed. So these are the location plans. In the plan on the left, not this area of the development isn't shown because it hasn't been built yet. So it is approximately where the red arrow is pointing. And then the plan on the right, you can see how that fits in by looking at this short horseshoe of houses. The horseshoe shape is just to the south, so that's the plots up here. So the site's located on the corner of Craigbank Drive, which is this road, with West Craigbank Crescent, which is this road, with the garage being closest to the road junction, although still set back behind a grassed and tree-planted landscaped area of approximately 15 metres wide at its widest. And it can be seen that the garage also sits back from the building line on Craigbank Drive, this road. So I'm just, this building line is the one I was just mentioning. This is an image from Street View. Street View doesn't actually extend up West Craigbank Crescent, so you can't get a view from up here on Street View, just due to the relatively recent construction of the houses. This is a site plan as proposed, showing the extension and additional storey onto the garage. And this shows the footprint as extended of the garage on the upper level. And these drawings show the proposed garage. So it would be extended back. The grey area is the existing wall of the garage. So it'd be extended back and upwards. And I've got drawings as existing to show you on the next slide. So it can be seen from the notes that the materials would match the existing house, and the width of the garage would stay the same at approximately 6 metres, whilst the length would increase by 2.9 metres to 8.9 metres overall. And the roof would be altered to be a double pitch with gable ends. So the overall height of the roof would be 7 metres, with the eaves at 4.1 metres. And the increase in height would be 1.6 metres over the existing garage. And the applicant has stated in their submissions that the footprint of the garage would increase by 34%. So that's the plans of the existing garage, which is roughly square in footprint, with 6 metre width at the front. And obviously the roof configuration is different. In terms of consultations, there were no comments, including from the Colts, Bilside and Mill Timber Community Council, and there were no representations. So reasons for refusal stated in full in the report of handling in the agenda, but the main points were the adverse impact on visual amenity of the surrounding area due to the layout, composition, size and scale of the proposal in this location, and that it's not secondary to the main house in terms of height, form and scale, and that it's therefore contrary to policies H1 and D1 and the Householder Design Guide. So for the applicant, the points made are that this is a corner plot and it's set back from the street with green space and young trees and shrubs in front of it, and these will grow and together with fencing provide screening from Craig Bank Drive. That the design and scale match similar structures built by Colour elsewhere in the development, and there's images of those in the statement, and that design and materials will align with the house, the existing house, the personal reasons that I outlined earlier. And in terms of the footprint and height increase, the proposal is secondary to the house, and that an alternative proposal would be a gable extension to the main house, and that would have more impact. So at that point, I will hand back to you, convener, for a decision on how to proceed.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members, remember that if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request that further written information be provided, hearings be arranged, or a site visit be undertaken. I would say that I have sufficient information to undertake a decision. Councillor Clark, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision? And if you do not feel if any other further procedures are required, please state for the minutes the reason why.
I don't need any further information. I think I've got enough evidence to go ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Van Sweden, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision? And if you do not feel Any further procedures are required. Please state for the minute the reasons why.
I feel I have sufficient information, convener.
Thank you. As members feel they have sufficient information, we will now hear from Ms Green on the relevant planning policies and considerations for this review. But back to you, Ms Green.
Thank you. So the site lies within an area that's zoned in the adopted local plan under policy LR1, which is land release, and that related to the land being released for housing. So as it's now developed, policy H1 residential areas would be the relevant policy in terms of residential extensions. And obviously that policy finds that residential development is acceptable in principle, subject to the various criteria. So the first criteria is overdevelopment, and the same 50% of the rear or front curtilage would apply, taken from the householder guide. The second criteria relates to the impact on character and amenity. And the third criteria is not relevant, that's the loss of open space. Then the fourth criteria, the householder guide, is the relevant consideration in terms of that. So looking at the householder development guide, as I mentioned, 50% coverage of the front or rear curtilage is what it suggests as appropriate maximum. In terms of the rules for outbuildings, including garages, there are various criteria. Talks about them being subordinate in scale to the dwelling house, and two-storey outbuildings generally not being accepted. Where there is a second story, it advises that that should be accommodated within a pitched roof space, so that outbuildings retain the impression of being single story. Access situated internally, which is the case here. Outbuildings shouldn't have a negative impact on the character of the area. And then it talks about where they're highly visible, detached garages should be of a scale and design that respects the context of the surrounding area. Proposals should be assessed on their impact on the amenity of the area. So considerations might be privacy and daylighting in the same way as extensions to the main house. It states that outbuildings wouldn't usually be acceptable in front gardens, which this one isn't. And then it talks about the building lines and the impact on the character of the area. So moving on to design policy. As I mentioned with the previous case, not all proposals have an impact on placemaking as such, but the importance of consideration of context and the detailing and good design having an impact on the quality of the built environment. So in terms of evaluation, applications should be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And in this particular case, policy H1, how would the proposal affect the character and amenity of the area, taking into account the householder development guide? So does the proposal comply with the development plan as a whole, or are there material considerations which would weigh for or against the proposal? Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms Green. Are there any questions?
No.
No. Looking at the plans, I just want to make myself sure that there's no impact on the light of the property to the west. I think it is, yes. With regards to overshadowing or anything, because it's quite a substantial increase in the height of the building.
Yeah, the report of handling details that issue of daylight and sunlight and finds that there isn't an undue impact on that neighbour in terms of lighting. So the refusal wasn't based on that factor.
Thank you. I just wanted to get that clear myself. No, I'm trying to ask if to phrase this, as it's a relatively new development. It's quite it's quite an impact on that corner. Looking at the image, if you could go back to page, bring up page 62 in the report, just to look at it from the Google ground view. I know I tried looking at it, and that you can't get anywhere further up. But if you could have a look at that.
Yeah,
it's the massing of the property on the development on that corner. I'm concerned about.
Page
62.
Thanks.
That's the one.
Sorry, my mouse is a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking at so it's going to be extended to the rear by an extra 30%, and it's going to be twice the height.
Sorry, I lost my connection for a second there. Could you just say that again?
No. So the extent of the excuse me, the extension to the rear is going to add another 30% onto that, the depth wise. So it's going to be
yes, I think it's
yes.
34% to the footprint and 1.6 meters to the height.
Okay, and that's does that include the height to the top of the gable?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Right. I wasn't quite sure about that. And we can't take into account the fact that I mean, it's difficult, but the trees that are planted along the edge there, would that be a consideration in future for screening, or can we not take that into account at the moment?
I mean, you would just take into account that in the future they may provide screening. So it's, I suppose it's of a slightly lesser weight than if they currently provided screening, but they are there.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Green. I don't know if it's appropriate at this point to get some legal input regarding the disability issue, or is that something we would have to take into private?
Thank you, Chair. Do you want to ask the question and then we can?
Yes,
I'm sure it's fine here.
Yeah, it's the consideration of how material the providing of accommodation for someone with a disability is, and from what my understanding is that they won't be permanent resident. They would be visiting. I'm just wondering what the legal situation on that would be.
So the weight that you apply is for the local review body, for yourselves really to determine. I think you would potentially have to assess and think about the intensity of that use, maybe the frequency of that, but the weight that you should apply to that is for yourselves. And it also has to be obviously put in the pot, if you like, along with the policies and the other material considerations to weigh up. But yes, unfortunately, I can't give a steer on that from a legal perspective. It would be for yourself to decide the weight that should be afforded.
Thank you. Okay, any further questions from members? No. Right. Thank you, Ms. Green. In accordance with the procedure note calculated with the local review body, we'll now discuss and decide the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been made, considered and taken into account. I must admit, I'm a little bit conflicted by this one. I am actually minded to overturn the officer's recommendation, and that's primarily on the material consideration that it will be used to provide accommodation for even if it's only part-time with someone with a disability. With regards to the other points with H1, I do think it's verging on overdevelopment, but not quite. So yes, I do have concerns with it, but I think as it's been stated, for when it comes to dealing with issues for providing accommodation for people with disabilities, even on short terms, I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. I'm quite happy with most of the other things. I think it's verging on overdevelopment, but not quite. With regards to policy D1, as it's a new development and it's actually going to be of the same materials, I have less concern with that. So I'm quite happy that it fills policy D1 and H1, and I think the overriding thing for me is providing space for somebody potentially living there long term for someone with a disability. Councillor Clark, could you please state if you have sufficient? Oh, sorry, going back a bit. Could you please state your decision in respect to the application and state for the minute the grounds for that decision, referring to the planning policy where appropriate?
Right, likewise, convener, I was a bit concerned of the corner there, the overdevelopment of that section, but on looking at the house adjacent to it, the nearest one, I was thinking the height, it mightn't be that big an issue. That was my first concern, the fact of the height and that they had a side window. But as I've gone through it more, I am happy that there is not a huge overdevelopment. It's a new area. I'm glad they're going to be keeping it all on the same as in D1. It's not going to be totally different. It's going to be done with the same materials. So I am going to overturn the decision, and the impact on the character is just going to be this. There's going to be no impact on it. It's just going to blend in with the rest. So I'm quite happy for it to go ahead.
Councillor Van Sweden.
Yes, I am again going to support the officer's decision here. I feel, yes, with policy H1 amenity and also the householder development guide with reference to the pitch roof and headroom, you know, this building will not be secondary to the initial building. And with regards to a relative who's disabled, I would suggest that perhaps a ground floor extension might be more suitable, especially one that doesn't have a rotated staircase. So those would be my reasons for also supporting the officer in this case.
Thank you, Councillor Van Sweden. As the local review body has agreed to overturn the decision of the appointed officer, we now need to consider whether any conditions should be attached to the appropriate application. Have we got any conditions that need to be applied? Ms. Green.
Yes, I was just going to mention you may wish to consider a condition that prevents the new accommodation being used as a separate dwelling house. I mean, it would need permission for that, but we would usually condition or even put a section 75 on that they shouldn't be used as a separate dwelling house.
Thank you, Ms. Green, for bringing that. I think that's a condition that I would welcome if we could add that condition in, that it not be used as a separate dwelling house. And yeah, that was one concern that I did have. Thank you for that, Ms. Green. So if we're all happy with that, we will add the condition as drawn to our attention by Ms. Green that it's not used for a separate dwelling house. Okay, happy?
Yeah, totally agree.
Right. Okay, please note that the decision notice from today's meetings will be issued to the applicant or agent after the meeting. Now, turning to the request of the third review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for detailed planning permission for the installation of solar panels to roof at 1 Westerton Road, Aberdeen, reference number 2206667 DPP. We will now hear from the planning advisor in attendance, Ms. Lucy Green, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and remainder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would point out again that Ms. Green attends today's meetings to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because she has not been involved in the early consideration of the application under review. Ms. Green will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits or the proposed development, and in fact, her role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance over. Back to you, Ms. Green.
Thank you. Right. So this application relates to a refusal under delegated powers of a proposal for the installation of solar panels at 1 Westerton Place. And the review was submitted with all the necessary information within the time limit of 3 months following the decision of the appointed officer. The applicant indicated on the notice of review that there are no new matters within the submissions and that they were content for the review to proceed on the basis of the information submitted. So I will provide some background information before handing back for a decision on how to proceed. So this is the location plan, and the site's located on Westerton Place, which is this road, and that's off Westerton Road, just to the south of the Deeside Way, which is here, within the Pitfoddles Conservation Area. And this is just the overhead photo taken from Google, and the application premises consist of this block. So this is the original house, and then this is an extension of 1.5 or 1 3/4 stories. And that's the 3D view. You can see the 2 elements of the house there, the original and then the extension. And they're traditional building. It's a traditional building with a slate roof, and also denotes a number of mature trees in the surrounding area. So this is a plan showing the proposed solar panels in blue. And you can see they would be located on the south-facing roof slopes of both the main house and the extension. And that's 3D view with the area for the panels shown. Proposed side elevation, or sort of indicative elevation. And these are just the details of the proposed panels. showing the sort of finish and the brackets that would be used to fix them onto the roof. So the panels would each have a size of 1.13 metres by 1.72 metres, and they would sit 213 millimetres above the existing roof plane. They would have black frames. And in terms of consultations, there were no comments from the Community Council. So turning to the reasons for refusal, which are stated in full in the report of handling in the agenda. The first reason is that the requirement for solar panels and alternative improvements had not been sufficiently explored. So they hadn't provided sufficient information on what improvements had taken place to improve energy efficiency. That secondly, the location and design of the panels would be overly prominent on the front elevation and with an adverse impact on the conservation area. That they are contrary to policy H1, residential areas, D1 on design, D4 on historic environment, and R8 on renewables, and also the household design guide, and that they were also contrary to historic environment policy statement for Scotland and the managing change guidance on roofs and micro renewables. So the case for the applicant can be summarised as follows. That the panels would be grey on a grey roof and that not raised particularly high above the roof, and that they would complement the building. That they had gone through an assessment to get a loan from the Energy Saving Trust, which looks at insulation and existing energy savings prior to having a loan approved. That the house is heated by gas and that electricity from the panels would be used for electric vehicles as there was no heating need from the electricity, and that the solar panels would reduce carbon dioxide emissions as the use of the grid electricity would decrease, and the grid, taking into account that grid electricity is coming largely from burning gas. And there were no representations received. So I'll hand back to you, convener, to decide how to proceed.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take the decision on the application. Members, remember, if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request that further written information be provided, hearings be arranged, or a site visit be undertaken. I feel that I have sufficient information today to proceed. Councillor Clark, could you please state if you have sufficient information to make a decision? And if you do not, do you feel any other further procedures are required? Please state for the minutes the reason why.
No, I feel I've got sufficient evidence to carry on with this today.
Thank you. Councillor Van Sweden, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision? And if you do not feel if any other procedures are required, please state the reasons for them in the minute for the reason why.
Convener, again, I feel I have sufficient information.
Thank you, Councillor Van Sweden. As members feel that they have sufficient information, we will now hear from Ms. Green on the relevant policies and considerations for the review. Oh, sorry, I've jumped ahead there. Are there any questions for Ms. Green? No, thank you. I again have a few.
Do you want me to go through the policies first?
Yes, if you go through the policies. Sorry, I'm all over the place this morning.
Just a moment. Right. So the site lies within an area designated under residential policy H1. And as we've seen on previous cases, residential development is acceptable in principle, dependent on these criteria. And the first one is overdevelopment, and the solar panels wouldn't have any impact on the footprint of the house. So that's not really relevant in this case. Second criteria is relevant in terms of the character and amenity of the area, which is a conservation area. There's no loss of open space in terms of criteria 3, and in terms of criteria 4, we have the householder development guide. This slide just lists the relevant policies. Policy D4 on the historic environment refers to the need to preserve and enhance the character of conservation areas, whilst policy R8 on renewables and low carbon energy developments, that includes the provision that they do not create harm to the local environment, including conservation areas. The policies in the proposed local development plan substantially reiterate those in the adopted plan, insofar as they're relevant to this application. So I won't go through those separately. The managing change guidance on roofs and renewables contains the most detailed guidance, and that requires that before considering micro renewables on historic buildings, other energy efficiency measures must have been explored. And it also emphasises the impact on conservation areas as well as the buildings themselves. And it expects that micro renewables would avoid main roof slopes of historic buildings. And the managing change guidance on roofs, that emphasises the importance of roofs to the character of the building and expects that alterations would be architecturally compatible with the original building. So in terms of that guidance, you would consider things like the colour of the panels, the extent of coverage of the roof, and how they would sit on the roof. The proposal, as I mentioned, lies within the Fuddles conservation area. And design policy, considering the context of the building and design detailing and good design having an impact on the quality of the built environment. And then overall, does the proposal, how does the proposal relate to policies within the development plan? Or are there considerations that would indicate otherwise? So overall, how would the proposal, taking into account the energy efficiency measures, as mentioned before, how would the proposal impact on the character and amenity of the area in terms of H1 and the other relevant guidance? In this case, probably most relevant is the managing change guidance, which is a material consideration. So does the proposal comply with the development plan, and how do the material considerations impact upon that decision? Okay, thanks, and I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Any questions from members?
No.
No. Again, I have a few. The massing on the roofs. I believe it in reading through the report that the within a conservation area, the massing of such solar panels should be avoided on the main part of the building. So, for example, we could actually accept them on the extension, but it would be against policy to accept them on the main part of the building, given their current format. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean the managing change guidance would consider the impact on the historic building itself, and that would advise against putting them on the main roof slope of the building itself. And then wherever the panels are, you would take into account the impact on the conservation area. So yeah, the report does indicate that there'd been discussions about putting them onto the extension, of which obviously isn't the original historic building.
Right.
But there would still be a relevant consideration in terms of the conservation area impact.
Yeah. is there any concern about how far they actually project from the roof within the conservation area? Because it's reading it's 230 millimeters, which doesn't sound a lot, but that's 23 centimeters, and that's quite a projected height from the roof line. So if what I'm getting at is that if they had different solar panels that would actually say fit flush with the roof line, would that be more permissible, or would yeah, I mean, is there anything that would be acceptable in a situation like this, where I did read in the papers that there was solar tiles that could actually replace the slates? Would that be acceptable in this context?
I mean, I think there are different types that would be the recessed on the roof, or the tiles that you mentioned, and there's obviously a cost implication to those. You'd still be weighing up the energy efficiency benefits against the historic building, the impact on the historic building, and that would be, you know, that would be down to the decision maker at the time on that proposal. So that's for the main house. In terms of the extension, the balance might be slightly different, but again, you're balancing the impact on the conservation area against the energy efficiency. So that would be for members to.
And reading through the papers, I don't think we've actually have we actually had any information regarding the energy efficiency that it would add to, because it, I don't know whether it's relevant that in this context that they're still going to be using gas for the heating. Is that something that we would have to take into account if they stop using gas heating? Would that be a consideration we would have to take in? I know these might be this is new sort of questions that we're going to get going forward. So I don't know if you can actually answer that.
I mean, the applicant has stated that in order to get the loan for the panels, they had to install some energy efficiency measures, and I don't think there's a great deal of detail on that, other than it involves insulation and some heat, sort of waste heat, reuse of waste heat from electrical appliances. I mean, you'd be balancing energy efficiency against the impact of on the historic building. So we need to consider the proposal that's in front of us, which does involve, you know, the heating that they have at the moment, and then balancing that against the impact on the conservation area and historic building.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Is there any further questions? No. In accordance with the procedure notes circulated, the local review body will now discuss and decide the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. Sorry, I'm just getting the sun coming through into my eyes. So this is, to me, this is a difficult one, bearing up the balance between lowering emissions and preserving conservation areas. On the whole, I'm minded to support the officer's recommendations, mainly with regards to policy H1, where I think that the design of these will have an impact on the conservation area. I think that there are possibly alternatives that could be looked at, but unfortunately these aren't within this planning application. I think, again, with regard to policy D4, the impact on buildings within a conservation area, we have to be careful. And I just feel that the size and the massing of these solar panels are overwhelm the advantages, especially as there are possibly alternatives that could have actually been used. Again, with policy R8, I think it's a fine line. We're getting looking at solar panels on conservation, on roofs in conservation areas, but it is quite clear that that policy says that and I agree with, in this circumstances, the panels are not appropriate for use within the conservation area. So I will be upholding the officer's recommendation based on those features. Councillor Clark, could you please state your decision in respect of the application and state for the minute the grounds for that decision, referring to planning policy where appropriate?
Thank you. I actually support the officers. I feel the impact on the historical building in H1, it's a conservation area. I feel that it is making no difference to the heating of the house because the house is powered by gas. This is for electricity and would be used to possibly power vehicles. I feel that there was not enough detail given when they said what had been done to go for the grant. So I support the officer's decision in this. D4, historical environment, and R8. Again, it's a conservation area. I don't think it's in keeping with the area.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Van Sweden.
Yes, I'm also supporting the officer's decision here. It is a conservation area. I think that the solar panels are raised. I don't think that fits in. There is the possibility of installing flush solar panels or photovoltaic tiles. I think that would be something more to consider. But yeah, I would support the officer's decision.
Thank you, Councillor Van Sweden. As the local review body has therefore agreed to unanimously uphold the decision of the appropriate officer, and the application is therefore refused. Please note that the decision notice from today's meeting will be issued to the applicant or agent after the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for that this morning, and all of your inputs, and thank you, Ms. Green, and Ms. Close.